Thank you so very much. It's an honor, and I'm very deeply moved to have this reminiscence and appreciation from someone whose work I admire so much. We've worked on a lot of issues, and Princeton has been a setting for both your studies and my teaching. I also want to thank the graduate students for the invitation and the enormous pleasure of these conversations with you. I've just learned, it's been a grace, a gift, how much I've learned in discussions, and memories that I'll take with me, and I know we will remain in conversation over the next years. This lecture, one of the discussions we had in the graduate seminar had to do with a paper that I'd written about book history, which ended up with some reflections about whether some of the issues that came up in the early days of printing in regard to property, in regard to censorship, were still current in these days of the move to digitalization and electronic media. And indeed, my lecture is on language and information flow today. In addition to being grateful to the Burge family for founding these lectures, I kind of wanted to remember Aaron Swartz, who some of you may have read, committed suicide on Sunday at age 26, this extraordinary figure in electronic communication, helping us have connection, and who devoted his young life to trying to extend knowledge through the electronic media, and was deeply discouraged by some of the attacks on his efforts at openness. So in thinking of language and information flow in a slave society, I sort of have the ghost of Aaron Swartz that I'd like to placate and remember. So dealing with strangeness, language and information flow in an early modern slave society. Inga Clendenin begins her beautiful book, Dancing with Strangers, with encounters in 1788 between the Pacific peoples and Europeans as British Navy men touched land for the first time on an Australian shore. Communication between the English seamen and the Australians took off when the men began to dance together, holding hands and circling round while everyone sang in his own language. Though the future held in store relations that were much less peaceable and much less egalitarian, Clendenin still finds this beginning of relevance and understanding what English and Australians could learn about each other. Not inner worlds of mind and spirit, but at least externalities, some of which could be tolerated. When I first read Clendenin's pages, I thought how different was this specific encounter of free men, because they were all free, from those which I have been following between Africans and Europeans on the Atlantic slave ships and on the plantations of the Dutch colony of Suriname. European agents for African trading companies and ship captains observed dances in the areas from which they acquired slaves and other trade goods, but never participated in them or were invited to do so. On board the slave ships, the African men and women were brought up on the decks by sailors and made to dance for exercise, the men stumbling in their chains. On the Dutch ships, captains were instructed to have African drums and other instruments aboard to keep the people moving while they danced. On the plantations, dancing began in the slave quarters as soon as the work stopped late Saturday afternoon and often continued all day Sunday. Europeans were sometimes able to watch these dances. This particular one is, this diorama is not by a European, or rather it's by a descendant of a slave with some European parents. But some were able to watch these dances and wrote about them or even painted them. But taking part in them was unwanted and unthinkable. When dance crossed lines of color in Suriname, it was among free people, as in the so-called, quote, mulatto balls of the later 18th century, attended by people of color and some of the Jewish settlers. In these settler slave societies, language and translation were central means of dealing with strangeness, an unfamiliarity which lasted even after a locally born generation of unfree children grew up on the plantations. Along with cultural gaps, the relations of power among the speakers certainly affected the back and forth flow of information, both its presentation and its reception. To explore this flow, I'm going to concentrate on two language books, two dictionaries, produced in Suriname through active collaboration between Europeans and persons of African descent. I'm purposely looking at people in close contact, since their conversation can highlight what is at stake differently from larger interactions. Such encounters on a large scale are often interpreted in terms of opacity of the two sides to each other, or in terms of the power acquired by one side through the knowledge extracted or the point of view imposed. Here, when people are trying to find word equivalence, is there also the possibility of joint learning along with imposition, and of understanding and illumination along with miscomprehension, deception, and silence? Is there space for resistance and ambivalence, as well as enforcement and control? Well, let's look at these people at work finding meaning, likeness, and difference across boundaries not always very easy to cross. For first-generation Africans in Suriname, language was an issue already on the slave boat. Captains often hired a free African who knew some of the languages of the regions from which the persons had been captured. His job was to translate orders for conduct during the voyage, what the slaves were supposed to do, and to report any signs of mutiny. In addition, young men considered trustworthy among the captives were selected out to be what were called bombas, B-O-M-B-A-S, bombas, that is, directors of captive work crews. Taught some phrases in Dutch and rewarded with extra food rations, they too were expected to pass on any word of revolt. Meanwhile, in their separate holds, the men and the women and the children who would be with the women were trying to find a common language among their African tongues, or to create a pidgin for the length of the Middle Passage, some of them able to draw on a Portuguese creole language current along the African coast. These language exercises were good preparation for their future life in Suriname. But let me shift just for a moment now and introduce you to that colony. Founded initially by the English, Suriname had become a Dutch colony in 1669. And here's a map from the 18th century book by Stedman. Can you see it, sort of? Here's the, is this working? Okay, press down. Here's the, am I getting it? Here's the Atlantic Ocean. And here are the main rivers where we're going to see there will be plantations. Many of the plantations I'm talking about are around here. Well, here's the Suriname River. Here's the Kamawine. So this is the area. Brazil is down south. So founded initially by the English, it had become a Dutch colony by 1669. The initial settler population had been mixed. Dutch, English families who stayed on after the colony became Dutch, French Huguenots, many Portuguese Jews, and by the mid-18th century, when we pick up the story, Germans, Swiss, Swedes, and German Jews had been added to a European population of about 2,500 settlers. To the sugar plantations, which had been the colony's original hope for profit, had now been added coffee, cocoa, cotton, and timber plantations. These crops were produced by the strenuous labor of some 50,000 to 60,000 slaves of African origin. So high was their death rate and so low their rate of fertility that the majority of these men and women were still, quote, saltwater people, Sotawatro Soma in the local language, who had been carried to Suriname on the harsh Middle Passage. Some of them had been brought up in Angola and the Congo, others on the Gold Coast, many more from the kingdoms along the Bight of Benin, that is present-day Benin, Benin, and Togo in western Nigeria, others yet from inland kingdoms. In the dense rainforests stretching out beyond their plantations were villages of indigenous peoples, Caribs, Arawaks, and Wayanas, and even more populous, the settlement of a few thousand Maroons, men and women who had escaped the plantations and their progeny, divided into two constructed tribes known as the Juca and the Saramacca. From time to time, groups of Maroons came down the rivers to attack the plantations, get provisions, and assist slaves to escape. And here's a plantation along the Kamawine, the kind of, the Maroons might come in it. This is what they looked like as seen by Stedman, actually, John Gabriel Stedman. Out of the Babel of tongues spoken in Suriname had emerged early two associated Creole languages. One was known in Dutch as Niger Engels, or Niger Englische, Black English, which had an English and West African lexicon, vocabulary, and an African substrate, and called today by linguists and by its speakers today, Sranen. But it was initially known as Black English, or in Dutch, Niger Englische. We should see this language as a creation not primarily of plantation owners and managers, but of elite slaves, black drivers, craftsmen, cooks, domestic servants, and seamstresses who were back and forth between the great house and the manager's office and the slave house and quarters and gardens. Sranen was taken into the forests by the Maroon Jucas and expanded with the generations of children born and growing up in the plantation. So it's a growing Creole language. A second Creole language emerged in a similar way on the plantations of the Portuguese Jews. And this is a picture of the central Jewish village on the Suriname River with plantations nearby. This had a lexicon, a vocabulary of Portuguese and West African words, along with the English words, some of them from Sranen, known as Jew Tongo, Jewish language, Tongo, Tang, Jewish language. It was carried into the forests by the early escapees from the Jewish plantations, whose tribe became known as the Saramacca, and language today is called by the linguist and by its speakers Saramaccan. Over the decades from 1700 to 1750, these Creole languages developed to cover the complex life of the slaves, growing on the plantations and across the porous boundaries between the plantations and on the rivers. Words concerned with family life and kin ties, work activities, religious belief and practice, food treatment and food taboos, illness, healing, harming, storytelling, and much more. Of the European residents on the plantations, the white driver, or to give the Sranen term, the Bakra Basia, Bakra for white, Basia for the driver, had to know sufficient Niger Englische, or Jew Congo, to give daily directions to the black driver, the Nengra Basia in Sranen, to order punishment, and to be aware of the moods and goings-on among the slaves. And, where is my little thing? I really like this particular, it's interesting, I hope you can see some of it. This is a harvest. This is a weeding and a harvest scene. And I don't know if you can see, can you see the man with the whip? Can you see him? That's the driver. He always has a whip in his hand. Whether he uses it is another matter. He's a very critical figure in this story. The plantation manager or director, as he was called in Dutch, the director of the plantation, Directora, or just Masra in the Creole language, might know the language just enough to give commands to his officers and house slaves, though some managers, a rather small number, around 1750, learned to speak it rather well. Sometimes the teacher of those who learned to speak it rather well was a house slave or a concubine. A similar range was found among the plantation owners and their families, most of whom did not know the language well at all, who, even if they had a house in the town of Paramaribo or in the Jewish village known as Jew Savannah, resided part of the time in the plantations. It was in such a situation in the 1750s that a man named Peter van Dyke decided to prepare a Dutch Niger English, a Dutch Black English vocabulary and instruction book. Van Dyke had come to Suriname from the Netherlands as a young man and had spent years as either a manager or a white overseer on a coffee plantation on the Kamawine River. His goal, he said, was to teach owners and managers, quote, to understand the slaves and to be understood by them. But his book was to have another purpose, through dialogues in black English, to show owners and managers, quote, how to make oneself respected and loved without committing the inhuman cruelties that sometimes become part of the work in Suriname. Indeed, observers' accounts from Suriname in the late 17th through 18th century talk of extended beatings of slaves with whips, especially chosen for their sting, after which the open wounds were rubbed with lime juice and pepper, and of the Spanish buck, as it was called, when the slave was whipped first on one side, then the other, with hands tied around the knees and a stick holding him or her to the ground. In a horrendous case in the 1740s, on a plantation off the Kamawine River, the manager accused a slave woman of poisoning slaves who in fact had died from his ill treatment, had her whipped, and himself tortured her to try unsuccessfully to get her to admit her guilt, and finally beheaded her as the other slaves shouted her innocence. During the 1750s, uprising took places on many plantations, and the forest trails were filled with escapes to the Maroons. Making peace with the colonial government in 1759, the Maroon Juka spokesman blamed all this on managers, quote, drunkenly abusing us according to their pleasure, having sex with our women and neglecting our sick. Van Dyke and the slaves on his plantation knew these stories that I've just described for you. They were circulated all over on the Kamawine and beyond. And they are echoed in the book, new and unprecedented instruction in black English. Though he did not mention collaborators explicitly in his preface, it would have been absolutely impossible for Van Dyke to prepare this book without accomplished speakers of the tongue. The instruction opens with vocabulary lists in Strangeness and Dutch organized by theme. For instance, in the section on kinfolk, the elders, the tata, and the mama are distinguished from the reiti, that is, the right grandparents, thus giving a brief glimmer of the important role of ancestors in African religious belief. 12 dialogues illustrate possibilities in conversation, though only 2 of them seem to be between slaves. The others involve masters giving orders or asking questions of slaves with brief responses from the latter, and also, curiously enough, Europeans talking Sranan among themselves, which they very rarely did at this date. The most innovative feature of the instruction is a play in Sranan with Dutch translation entitled The Life and Business of a Suriname Plantation Manager with the Slaves on a Coffee Plantation. The manager displays the worst possible traits. He drinks to excess, orders long whippings, and the Spanish buck when the coffee water is simply slow to boil or a slave complains of a stomachache, shoots and kills the black hunter when there is simply no game to be had, and forces a married woman to his bed, leading her husband to commit suicide. Both the black and white drivers in the play, the Nangrabasia and the Bakrabasia, try in vain to dissuade the manager. The black driver does the ordered punishing half-heartedly, but also allows the wife to flee the plantation and escape to the Maroons. Other slaves also escape to the Maroons, and those that remain on the plantation call a meeting organized and chaired by the cook Lucrezia, who is head of the house slaves. She addresses them in the courteous fashion practiced among the slaves. And I just should add in passing that this courtesy is very much a carryover from much more elaborate African form of address. But she too, and it's used widely in certain, she addresses them as master blacks, master negri, master blacks. And they appoint one of their number to sneak away and inform the owner of the plantation, who lives in Paramaribo. And so you have here the trope of the good, at least the responsive owner and the bad manager. The manager is then duly replaced. In celebration, The black driver gets permission for a night of dancing and drumming, which the old manager had prohibited, and the next day presides over a funeral for a woman who has died through ill treatment. The ritual in the play follows the African practices adapted by the slaves of Suriname, from the prescribed way of carrying and singing to the corpse, to the goodbyes to the soul of the dead as the soul returns to its ancestors. Ajusi, Kunetazize, Wakabun, Taki ala Zomedodi, Korbai, Minim Zikagada Zahelpiyo. Farewell, good night, sister, get home safely, say hello to everyone in the next world, say hello, goodbye, my namesake God will help you. And the namesake God, the Nemsiki Gado, is each one's special ancestral spirit. And here she's saying, my ancestral spirit will help yours go to the next world and return actually home to Africa. The slaves eat and drink, this is all in the play, near the grave and leave food for the deceased. The play ends as the black driver says a last goodbye to her, Kunedi mi hati lobi, Kunedi for ala master negri, wakibon. Goodbye, sweetheart. Goodbye from all the master blacks. Travel well. Peter Van Dyke's collaborators must have been the slave elite on this plantation. The black driver, the name Rabasia, and the leading woman, usually the cook at the great house, who themselves would have consulted with the other slaves. Let's see where appointed as a young man, the Basia was by 1750, if not earlier, always born in Suriname, with Sranan, black English, as his tongue since birth. And in this picture, there he is. Can you see? You see he's standing above, he's got a knife, and he's watching. This is the black driver. This is the figure. I showed you a smaller picture of him watching the religious dance. This is a dance of possession. But by 1750, he would be what's called a creole. He would be locally born. He was a complex figure who had the ear of his superiors, and if he were to have any success at all, had to be trusted by his fellow slaves. This meant combining the political skills of an African chief learned from his parents and the many saltwater blacks on the plantation, those who had come across, with local-born, with Creole-born savvy about what to pass on to the white bosses. Control of information was one of his most precious tools. The leading cook or seamstress at the big house was most often born in Suriname, not always, and had to have similar skills of communication if she were going to have to protect the plantation women. She was going to be able to protect the plantation women and win favors for them and for her kin, say, in easing up on the workload of heavily pregnant women, to get that kind of policy through, to get that kind of pressure through. She would use her negotiating skills. She had to be in touch with the women healers, the women diviners and midwives, and the leading women dancers. And this particular, the dance that I showed you before, on the one hand, she had to be in very good touch with them and know what to tell her white mistress and master and the manager on the other, and what to hold back. What stakes would the Basia and the head cook have in cooperating with Peter Van Dyke on a Sranan Dutch instruction book? To begin with, it was a chance to learn some Dutch and improve their knowledge of the interests of owners and managers, always helpful to slaves and subalterns of any kind. Further, they might appreciate Van Dyke's hope that spreading the knowledge of Sranan would improve the conduct of managers and owners, even though they could hardly be optimistic about that possibility. And finally, they themselves had some power in the situation. They could withhold information as they wished, and surely did so. Suriname, Nengra Basia, Suriname black drivers went well beyond the mild protests of the driver in Van Dyke's play, who just says, oh, don't hit her so hard, but then he goes ahead and follows the rules. They go way beyond that mildness when dealing with an excessively putative manager or owner. Unknown to the whites, a good number of maroon attacks on the plantations were at the specific invitation of black drivers, and some of the mass escapes of from the plantations had the Basia Negra at their head. This was a subject on which to keep very silent. Van Dyke took the manuscript of the instruction to Amsterdam for publication around 1763. There wasn't any local press yet in Suriname. It doesn't come to the 70s. The book had some readers. John Gabriel Stedman referred to it in his celebrated narrative of his years in Suriname, and a later Strana Dutch dictionary copied much of its vocabulary. The Life of a Plantation Manager, that play, inspired another play intended to reduce plantation cruelty some decades later. And the book may have had some impact on reform of local legislation. In 1784, hanging a slave by the wrists for beating, which you saw in an earlier picture, was prohibited in Suriname. At least in the Van Dyke book, people of different ancestral origins, social status, and cultural traditions, and relations to literacy produce a text that perpetuates the status difference, but shows a common humanity in words and deeds. Van Dyke's instruction carried no mention of Christian teaching or devotion at all. And the Nemsikigade, that is the namesake God, called upon at the funeral, was the only sign of religious belief in the entire play. This is no accident, for there had been little effort at conversion on the Christian plantations by the mid-18th century. Reformed pastors, Protestant Reformed pastors, all of them owners of plantations, and other Christian-minded proprietors sought to baptize only those few slaves who were likely candidates for manumission, people of color, mulattoes as they were called, and others perceived as very unusual who were then taught a little Dutch. In 1731, a Dutch-speaking pastor full of zeal to convert all the Caribs, Arawaks, and all the African slaves had arrived from the Netherlands, but was soon sent packing, and by the ministers as well as the owners. Plantation owners feared conversion would make their slaves restless and uppity. For decades, white overseers were heard telling their slaves in Sranan that blacks, quote, that blacks can be created by the devil and that the Christian God was just for white people. And this is a very widely heard saying, and slaves sometimes will say this. They heard this. All of this was a matter of indifference to the many slaves practicing the Afro-Surinamese religions with their own Lukamen, seers, and you hear the word look, the Lukmen, the Lukamen, seers, Gado-men, men of God, Grandmama and Grandtata, that is the priests and diviners who communicated with the gods, and the Winti dancers. The Winti was a dance in wind, Winti dancers, who were possessed by the gods. But one group of Christians was unwilling to see Suriname remain in the clutches of unbelief. The recently formed Moravian Brethrens, those worldwide evangelicals. They came everywhere. They came to Labrador, to Newfoundland, they go everywhere. Despite their insistence to slave owners that conversion to Christianity brought only freedom from damnation, not freedom from slavery, the brethren were still unwelcome on the plantations. They kept saying, you don't have to free your slaves after they become Christian, but they were kept at bay. Thus, after the colonial government had made peace with some of the Maroons, the brethren turned to proselytizing in their rainforest villages, especially among the Saramakas. Learning the language of the free blacks, as the brethren always called them, was urgent. We are spending our time learning the Portuguese speech, which the free blacks have learned from the Jews. As you remember, the Saramaka mostly had come the first generations from the Jewish plantations. A missionary wrote back to the brothers in Herrenhut in 1766. It was in this setting that Brother Christian Ludwig Schumann decided a decade later to compose a Saramakan German dictionary with the collaboration of Alabi, a tribal captain of the Saramaka. Though their traditions were worlds apart, the two men had been born in the 1740s, about 200 miles from each other. Christian Schumann was the son of a Saxon theologian who converted to the Herrenhutter, as the brethren were called, came with his wife to Berbice, which is just west of Suriname, on a mission to begin with to the Arawak Indians. One of Christian Schumann's father's earliest accomplishments was an Arawak German dictionary, and grammar. Young Christian was sent back to Saxony for studies with the Moravian Brethren, then returned to Suriname in 1776, establishing himself with his mission far south on the Saramacca River. A year later, he was deeply disheartened by the illness felling him and his few brethren, and even more by the very few converts among the Saramacca that they had won to Jesus. "It is particularly painful to me," he said, "that the preaching of the gospel here for such a long time has borne no fruit. I have shed many tears because of this." Nonetheless, he prayed to the Savior for endurance and then plunged into work on the dictionary. His collaborator was Alabi, born on the Saramacca River to a great tribal chief and a grande mama, that is, a priestess. As a teenager, Alabi had accompanied his father to peace negotiations with the Suriname government, and after his father's death in battle in 1767, he became captain of his Saramaccan village. This gave him local authority, but also required canoeing down the river to meetings with colonial authorities, where he had to speak Sranan rather than his native Saramaccan, so he knew both Creoles. And I have no picture of him, but I have. It's going in the wrong direction. I guess I never showed that. There's his father with an arawak, and this is Stedman. Stedman showing a maroon warrior. Let me go back. Here is a photograph of Saramaccan around 1900. So you have in Stedman's picture and this gentleman from 1900 a little bit of a sense of what Alabi, how he might have looked. In the same years that he was achieving this status, he also was drawing closer to the Moravian Brethren. "The sufferings of Jesus have made a great impression on Alabi," one of the missionaries wrote. "His heart is taken with the Gospels." Alabi proceeded to a number of tests, shooting an obia, that is a sacred object imbued with God, and killing a divine snake to see if the gods would then take revenge against him, as the many believers around him prophesied they would. But the gods were powerless. He shot the obia, shot the snake, nothing happened to him. And Alabi was baptized as Johannes in 1771. It was a relief, he said, to lay down the constant burdens of pacifying his special goddo, his special God, and the spirits of the dead, and simply bask in the love and passion of Jesus. In the next years, he constructed a life as both a Saramaccan and a Christian. He headed the village council, arbitrating disputes and judging cases of sorcerer or poisoners with as much severity as his clansmen who clung to the Saramaccan gods. So he behaved fully as a Saramaccan leader on the one hand. If some Saramacca wanted to see Alabi dead because of his constant sacrilege, the reputation of his ancestors, his role as distributor of yearly goods from the colonial government, and his personal force kept him in place even though he was a Christian. He was eventually to become a tribal chief of all the Saramacca. As a believer in Jesus, Johannes Alabi wanted to make a Saramaccan Christianity through language. In contrast with the few other male converts of his day who had learned to read and write, Alabi's gifts were of memory and speech. He had such an extraordinary memory, one brother said of him, that he could easily recall by heart all biblical phrases from the first missionaries, which had been little by little incorporated into his deficient native tongue, into Saramaccan. He sought every opportunity to be instructed on the true meaning of these biblical expressions so that he could preach them clearly in Saramaccan to his brothers. It was in this spirit of trying to further a Saramaccan Christianity that could flourish amid the forest gardens and rice fields of the free blacks that Johannes Alabi approached the Saramaccan German dictionary project of Brother Schumann. He had his own investment in this. The joint work was presumably oral, with Schumann recording in his diary. I have gone over everything exhaustively with our Johannes and approved it accordingly. The resulting dictionary is not a German Saramaccan handbook for a Christian trying to write sermons in Saramaccan or translate hymns or parts of the gospel into that language. Schumann himself had made such translations in another place, but that's not what this is for. Rather, it is a Saramaccan German entry into the life and language of the Saramacca Maroons, a way to understand what they are saying and to be part of a conversation on many subjects. Some 1,000 words are given in alphabetical order, in Saramaccan alphabetical order, not in German, with multiple definitions and frequent examples of word use in sentences. Webs of precise terms for local fruits, plants, animals, and fish as they are eaten, caught, hunted, or observed. For the cultivation of rice, because it's so interesting that you don't have rice in the plantation, but you have rice in the Maroon, among the Maroons, not only here but elsewhere. It's the cultivation of rice and manioc and the preparation of flour for garments for men and women and children and their cloth. The delicate matters of barter and bargaining are suggested by the words kajenji and troca, like our truck. You often can see what either the Portuguese Romance language or English origins are, which can mean either exchange or deceive. Ladders of status are indicated from the hedimon, granjaman, and gendrimon at the top of the pole to the pobrimon, like poor, the poti, and at the bottom, while fry, the word for free, a status long struggled for by the Saramacca, carries also the meaning of peace. Saramacca religious beliefs are present in the dictionary in a way that fits better with Johannes Alabi's hopes for a reformed Saramacca than with a missionary's hunger for full information. Gado appears as a universal high god, but the panoply of Saramacca gods, well known to the son of a priestess mother, there are Afro-Surinamese, there's a whole panoply of Afro-Surinamese gods. That panoply is present only in Boma, the quote, boa constrictor, a great god of the blacks. That is the snake that Alabi himself had shot in his test for conversion, and which did not get revenge on him, so he converted. So that is in the dictionary. The two forms of the soul, the Gigi and the Jorka, both of them words from the West African Gabe language group, are defined simply as spirit or ghost, without the important distinction between the two that a believing Afro-Surinamese would have, where the Gigi is the god that returns to the namesake god at death, and the Jorka remains in this world of the living to help her haunt. Those distinctions, which would be very important to a person practicing the Afro-Surinamese religion, Alabi doesn't bother with. The dictionary does elaborate, however, on a set of African-derived words for religious practices deemed superstitious, aberglautisch, by Schumann and the convert Alabi. Kangra is the divination process of the Gadoman, the God-man, the priest, to establish guilt. If a chicken's quill passes through the tongue easily, the person is innocent, if not guilty. You can see how useful this is to the historian, but never mind. This is in the 18th century. Kandu is a special object hung to keep people away from a place, quote, like the Strawwich bundle of straw placed in a field in Germany, Schumann adds. But the blacks have an extraordinary fear of it as of witchcraft. Obia is a bundle of medicinal herbs and other materials for the superstitious hocus pocus and oracles of the Obiaman. That's their language, superstitious hocus pocus. And Sechina is the special food and object for which each black has, quote, superstitious fear and thus must not eat or use it, since he or she holds it for a god. Interestingly enough, in this dictionary, they don't use the other word that they give to China. At the same time, in another text, the word is tref, and people here who know Hebrew will recognize that that's the Hebrew for something that you must not eat, for a taboo, a non-kosher food. So in fact, these Saramaccans from the Jewish plantations had two words for their food taboo. One was tichina, which is in the dictionary, and the other one, which was used simultaneously, was tref. But back to the dictionary, Kandu, Obia, and Ticina, these were the beliefs which had held Allaby captive in his pre-Christian days in what seemed to him never-ending obligation. We hear his relief in the entry for the word fada, loathing. Timi fili frivo gada nahati, tu le monde son di fadimi. Since I have the peace of God in my heart, I have loathing for the vanities of the world. And I just want to pause here and make a comment to those of you who were 16th century people working in the 16th century and the Reformation. Some of you are here. I'm going to do a non-historical thing for a minute and leave the 18th century and just tell you something. But I read Allaby's description of his relief in having to put aside the obligations of the constant service of his gods and his obia. There was a great deal of business. I immediately thought, and maybe some of the people who work on the Reformation will recognize it, of the early Protestant resistance of works righteousness. And you have quotes that are very much like this. I mean, Luther himself talks about, I tried and I tried to do my works, and I could never please God. And what a relief. And this is the kind of language that Allaby uses when he talks about the rejection of the obia for him. Of course, his fellow Saramaccan thought the works were fine, and they were happy to go along with it. To return to the 18th century, the dictionary was finished in 1778. Johannes Allaby remained loyal to his dream till the end of his long life, both Saramacca chief and Christian at the same time, but few converts were won. As an old man in 1810, he could be heard speaking to his children and grandchildren of the blessed water of Christianity, while the village around him was filled with the drumming and songs of his clansmen, making new obias and new goddess sticks. Christian Schumann departed from Suriname in 1783, leaving one copy of his manuscript with his fellow missionaries there, and another at the Herrenhut back in Saxony, before going on to do the Lord's work on the east coast of India. The manuscript was printed only in 1914 by the great linguist Hugo Schuchardt as a key document in the foundation of modern Creole studies. Let me conclude then with two figures who in a sense carry on the legacy of these Schranen, Saramaccan, Dutch, and German speakers, their ambivalences, their hopes, and affirmations. One is Hugo Schuchardt himself. Born in Germany in 1842, Schuchardt had studied philology with August Schleicher, a great figure in the foundation of German linguistic theory, whose ideas about language purity, embodied best in Sanskrit, and the natural organic character of language change, Schuchardt would later challenge. And I just want to stress in that summary of the purity of the school, stressed the purity of language and natural organic changes as opposed to popular change through voice. From his post as professor in Graz, Austria, for many years, Schuchardt wrote in defense of mixed languages, showing that there was mixture in vocabulary and even in the morphology of Slavic languages and a Romance language like Romanian. And why should there not be mixture? You see, he's attacking purity. Why should there not be mixture, he said, when you see how people from different age groups, backgrounds, and localities actually live and cross over from town to country? Against the recent theory of the neo-grammarians that changes in pronunciation happen by themselves, automatically, at the same time for everyone in a language group, Schuchardt said no. Pronunciation change comes about by the historical action of people, depending on whom they meet and whom they talk to and under what circumstances, and it could be sporadic, not regular. With such views, Schuchardt encouraged the serious studies of languages like Yiddish, which some linguists disregarded as, quote, very impure, with an intentional deformation of German words, German sounds, and the twistings of meanings. And with such views, Schuchardt himself embarked on the study of the Portuguese, Spanish, English, and Dutch-based Creole languages spoken in different parts of the world, including in the Caribbean, by people who themselves or their parents had only recently been emancipated from slavery. Here, linguists had been even more dismissive. These were not languages at all, but, quote, broken, barbarous, bastard, aberrant versions of real languages. And the people who spoke these languages were being disparaged as incapable of speaking anything better. Indifferent to such condemnation, Schuchardt sent inquiries in the 1880s to a few hundred colonial administrators, missionaries, and other prominent persons in places where he thought Creole languages and pidgins were being spoken. For the early history of Creole languages, Suriname was a blessing, since it was unusually well endowed with 18th century dictionaries and grammar books, of which you've heard about too. But there were others as well. I've given you the best ones, but there were others. Schuchardt worked from Schumann's manuscript in Paramaribo itself. He went to Paramaribo, and in publishing it, he undermined further the Indo-European-centered and Eurocentric judgment of language. And I quote from the introduction. When the Suriname black says, "Go take come," go techie come, for fetch, we regard it with astonishment as an African peculiarity, though fetching is actually a question of three distinct acts. The peculiarity is ours. Is it more natural to say, "I have hunger," as in French, he meant the French, "j'ai faim," than "hunger have me," "hungry kisi me," which is the way you would say "I'm hungry" in Stranan or Suramakan. The Suriname way of saying things, he said, is no more peculiar or unnatural than the European. One of the missionaries with whom Schuchardt had been in correspondence over the years was Samuel Ajaya Crowther, who in the 1880s was just ending his decades as bishop for the English Church Missionary Society in what we now call Nigeria, and who had authored back in 1852 a remarkable vocabulary of the Yoruba language. He had been born as a Jaya around 1806 in a Yoruba town where his father was a weaver and his mother a priestess of the great goddess Obatala. In 1821, when he was nearing 15, he was seized and enslaved by Oyo Muslim rebels who set fire to his town. Sold from person to person over a year, he finally reached the coast at Lagos, where he was bought by Portuguese traders. Only a few hours out of port, the Portuguese ship was captured by a British man of war. This is, the British are attacking the slave trade, policing the African coast to disrupt the slave trade. The slaves were all freed and taken to Freetown in Sierra Leone, where Ajaya learned quickly to read and write and was baptized as Samuel Crowther. Educated further, both in Freetown and in England, Crowther was sent by the Church Missionary Society on the 1841 Niger expedition, which is intended both to negotiate anti-slavery agreements with local rulers and to pave the way for British trade stations and missionaries in the region. At its end, Crowther wrote back to the Society from the African coast, fervently wishing that Africans themselves might serve as missionaries, rather than just Europeans. 2 years later, after more training in England, he was ordained a priest and soon was in Africa in his own Yoruba land as a missionary. It was there over the next 8 years that he composed his vocabulary of the Yoruba language. Crowther worked both from his knowledge of the language and from extensive interviewing. As the Bishop of Sierra Leone said in his preface to the book, quote, "The idiomatic sayings interspersed throughout the book were taken down by Crowther from the lips of his countrymen in the course of common conversation. The vocabulary is framed, to be sure, by Crowther's wish, which he shares with his readers, quote, for the day when all the dark continents shall speak the language of Canaan and swear to the Lord of hosts." He's quoting Isaiah chapter 19 there. But in the course of defining and explaining words, along with occasional negative phrases in regard to some Yoruba religious belief, there is simple ethnographic description, and in some places, powerful affirmation of Yoruba paths to virtue and wisdom equivalent to Christian ones. For instance, in identifying Oldumara, Crowther just says, "God the Almighty," and accepts him as the universal God, that is the same as the Christian God. And Oldemar is the high God. He's the god of the high God in the Yoruba panoply. And he doesn't just say their idea of God, he just says that's God, God the Almighty. For the word Orisha, he comments both, Orisha, both deity, object of worship, and God's idols. So he has God's idols, but also a deity. But he calls Obatala the great goddess, without adding anything pejorative. And we remember that his mother, in fact, had been a priestess to Obatala. For Ifa, the god of divination, and probably the most active competitor among the Yoruba with Christian divinity, he simply says the god of palm nuts. This is an extraordinarily important god, still very, very active kind of divination today. Crowther's most powerful affirmation of equivalence emerges in his discussion of Yoruba proverbs, and I quote him. In the Yoruba, there is an extraordinary exuberance of these sententious sayings, not confined to any particular caste, undertaking to be the guide of the rest, but everywhere in the mouths of all, imparting a character to common conversation and marking out a people of more than ordinary shrewdness, intelligence, and discernment. Proverbs are the national poetry of the Yoruba, comparable to the Hebrew poetry of scriptures. And he goes on, they display ideas concerning the providence of God, the moral rectitude of all actions, and the practice of social virtues, which we should hardly have expected to find in a people so wholly separated from the influence of that revelation which God has pleased to make of himself to man. Crowther then gives examples of proverbs in Yoruba, which, alas, I cannot pronounce. I tried it with the Suranan, but I can't do this. And English translation to illustrate his point. And here are some of the proverbs. He who ignores another injures himself. Ear, hear the other side of the question before you decide. Everything has a price, but no one can set a price upon blood. And many, many more proverbs throughout, which he discusses. The language books and dictionaries I've been telling you about were all filling in a wide cultural gap. Ordinarily attributed to a single author whose name is on the title page, the books were of necessity collaborative projects, including Crowther's. You heard about the interviews. Slave collaborators could influence the content by what they passed on and what they withheld, and could learn something of the intentions and mentalities of masters and their agents. A free black maroon could take over a missionary project for certain entries and shape them in his own way, to kind of imagine a Saramakan Christianity. For all those involved in making these books, the repeated practice of finding equivalence and identifying difference was in itself a political, social, intellectual, and even spiritual exercise. Participants and ultimately readers are brought to acknowledge the presence of others in the human conversation in both their strangeness and their familiarity. Such an exercise may seem like weak defense against the force of racist enslavement, ethnic cleansing, and the persecution of heretics and infidels. Still, giving voice to human understanding can contribute to the chorus of human solidarity. And who knows, one day the song may be loud enough to drown out the angry shouts of hate.
Dmitry from History Department. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. But I want to play devil's advocate for a second.
Yes.
And so, as much as these works, especially as dictionaries, right, can be seen as fostering a way to better cultural communication, they still are a product of colonialism. They still serve as much for fostering the domination and further enslavement. How do we distinguish? How can we be sure to ascribe more positive meaning than a negative meaning of domination to these works?
Certainly, the Van Dyke Dictionary. The Saramakan one is a little bit, because that really was in the world of free blacks. It is trying to, that particular one, although, as I said, if it had been a plantation, there would not have been an encouragement to free the slaves once they'd been converted. I think the Van Dyke is a good example. All the Van Dyke dictionary does is try to argue for a more benign form of enslavement. That's all it does. In 1750, 1760, there are few voices that are calling for the end of slavery. It takes really a long time for that movement to get going. The Quakers are just beginning. There are individual people there are a few people who come to Suriname, travelers from Sweden and elsewhere, who speak against slavery in their diaries, but they are few and far between. This is not an action against slavery. That's true. It is, but it has only two. In terms of the history of slavery, I repeat, it is an effort which is partly self-serving for the owners. By treating the slaves more benignly, they will not run away to the maroons. But two, within that frame, within a frame of a domination and oppression, it is a world in which, at least for the people that were living it, was a little bit more to their liking, a little bit more under their control. It's no better than that. This is not a revolutionary. It's not. I have asked myself, because of the fact that in Suriname it takes such a long time for any really abolitionist movement to get going. It's not till the 19th century, well after the development of an important movement in late 18th century England. I've asked myself what kinds of things lead to that later history of abolition. I don't know whether this does. I think there's other kinds of things that lead people to decide. I say this partly because when black people were freed in Suriname, they sometimes had plantations, the very successful ones, and even in Paramaribo, where many of them worked as artisans, the women were seamstresses and so forth, they sometimes had slaves. They also tried to free members of their family. So that it's really, the mentality is this is the way you live. And within that world, those who are trying to live it try to make it as, depending on how, those who are suffering it try to make it as bearable as possible. To leave my talk, the areas in which I have found the most movement away from simply a more benign form of slavery, where I found actual movement has been in regard to racism and conceivably this kind of communication that I'm talking about. I'm going to leave your exact example, but I know where you're coming from. That the most critical public expressions come, for instance, from a black woman slave owner, a free woman who had important plantations, who wanted to marry a white man who wanted to marry. They were both free Christians, and there was opposition to that marriage by the government, the Suriname local government, and she and he appealed all the way to the Estates General, and the documents in their case, which argue that a free black Christian and a free white Christian should be free to marry as free people, as free Christian people, is one of the most interesting expressions of something critical. But it's on the grounds of racism, and it's in with the notion of freedom. And I do find other examples, also within the Jewish community, from the black Jews, of that kind of movement. But it isn't directly challenging slavery. It's challenging the racism, which to some extent underpins. And to the extent that alibi is respected by Schumann, you can see that as some kind of movement, helping move against this deep racism it's an underpinning. But it is no more than that. And it's right, it operates within the world of slavery. That's true. You're right about that. So, thank you.
Professor Safir in the back.
My name is Neil Safir from the History Department. I wanted to ask you a sort of broader question about the category of, or strangeness as a category of historical analysis. Because it seems to me that in much of your previous work, and also in this project that you're trying to do, or that you presented to us today, strangeness is a very capacious category that can, on one extreme, be seen as racism, and on the other extreme could, in a sense, be seen as curiosity. And I wonder what kinds of, if you could just reflect more broadly on the appropriateness or challenges of the term as a way of getting at some of the experiences of being in between categories, also of to what extent strangeness is a category prior to language or as a result of language. I thought it was a fascinating use of historical dictionaries in that sense, because dictionaries codify, of course, what are seen as fixed and stable linguistic identities, but in fact people as individuals pass through various kinds of strangeness and familiarity with language. So I think it's a very complicated kind of term, and I was just curious.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Thank you very much. I hadn't really thought about the term with the care that maybe I should have. Two things. I wanted something to suggest that the first encounters. Is that me making that? I guess is that my microphone? Is making that squeaky? Is that mine? That strange noise is. Okay, he fixed it. Okay. Well, I'll tell you one honest confession. I liked the way it sounded. When I wanted a good title, I actually liked the idea. I thought that sounded nice, dealing with strangeness. I just thought it sounded good. So that's true, I really did. But I didn't give it. But I wanted to suggest areas. I didn't have anything too elaborate. I just wanted to suggest areas that were really the continuation of difference. Even, and I really mean this when I say even with the generations where the children are born locally, that unfamiliar features of things that people don't understand, that seem sort of weird and strange to them. And the thing I was thinking about in regard to the dictionary, it's true that they have fixed categories, but it was what I called a spiritual exercise, an exercise at the end, that when you're working together, even with situations of asymmetry of power and oppression and so forth, but if you're working on the process of finding equivalence, finding how to translate it, there's something that makes it seem, that can make it seem less strange. Now, there are these terms of superstition and that you get, especially in the Schumann dictionary, so that there's resistance persists, and I didn't have anything more. I didn't have anything more grand than that in thinking about it. I just wanted a word. I really wanted the pair strange and familiar. And it's true that maybe familiar is. In some ways, I'd have more reservations about the term familiar, which in fact, despite the dictionaries, it doesn't become. Perhaps I should rethink that, using that as a key pair, because there's a kind of unease even after you see the equivalence with certain kinds of things in these. In some ways, I think that the Crowther example is really my supreme one, because Crowther carries on Alabi's tradition of really wanting to have a Yoruba Christianity and remake it, with still holding on to what he sees as a deeply important contribution of Yoruba wisdom, and that's not familiar. So in a way, perhaps I've have used terms that don't work as well. There might be a better pair. But that's but I did want to have the idea of something that seemed really foreign, and that at least becomes a little bit more comprehensible, if not familiar. Thank you.
Jessica's right in line, and then we'll promise we'll get to the other side of the room.
Jessica Long from the Department of History. I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about the sort of lives that these dictionaries go on to lead, in the sense that I think you did a kind of masterful job of illuminating the social context from which they arose and the sort of values and worldviews that these dictionaries embodied.
Well, what happened?
But then, yeah, and I think
what happened afterward?
Yeah, this speaks to Dimitri's question.
Yeah.
But these dictionaries themselves, do they go on to sort of make
a difference?
Realities?
Yeah. Well, as I said, there's sort of a weak read against the force, the real forces. Schumann's dictionary. They may not have much of an impact. That is, I think the world of Schumann's dictionary and the Alabi-Schumann dictionary is more interesting than the use that it got put to later on. There were two manuscripts, so they were used by the Brethren in Suriname. And there's a little bit of a anti-racist aspect to this. They were used in conversion. They made practically these brethren. They're just such good sports. They hardly convert anybody. I think they finally do a pretty good job in Labrador and so with some of the Aboriginal people. But they just go right on, and they have their farms and their hospitals and so forth. And the way in which I think it turns out to be important is in regard to the kinds of things that you heard from Schuchardt. They went on, people who were using the Schumann dictionary, and they translated the Bible and published it in Sranan and in what was called bastard English to use, and in all kinds of Creole languages, and they were condemned for doing this. And then there's a response by people like Schuchardt, whom you heard in the later centuries, saying, and the response is, these people are human like us, and really quite an anti-racist response. So it's maybe just on that level of the recognition of the possibility of language being different. It's just in that area, not a deep criticism necessarily of slavery. But if we think of that as some part of the contribution to the criticism of racism, then that is a continuing function. I mean, the dictionary does generate other works in Creole languages, in the recognition that they're acceptable languages, that they, right now, we have English is spoken in many different ways all over the world. But so that may be the one meaningful thread that is somewhat transformative. But other than that, it's used for missionaries. I think the Van Dyke dictionary, I was trying to scratch when I said, might have had some consequence on some of the legal things. Its main use was probably just to people who wanted to be somewhat better managers, keep their slaves in better order. And insofar as it might make it more benign, that would be the limit. It's not a radical critique. But within the frame of thinking about language and respect for different kinds of languages, I think that they are examples of something that can help a small amount in that area. Van Dyke's book was not republished, though. I mean, with the Schumann, you have the continuation of the manuscript and so forth. So Van Dyke's book, when a book is important, it comes out in later editions. And though people read it, Stedman, I had Stedman, I was using Stedman quite a bit. Stedman uses it. In fact, Stedman often quotes from it without attribution. So it has its readers, but it is not, it's not a bestseller by any means. So.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Yes.
But if you have burning desires, or maybe two, but if you don't manage to get your question, please join us at the reception and maybe have a more private chat. So Samara, I think was the hand I saw. Just a little.
I just wanted to to ask about your experience with language, and you're bringing in an awful lot here.
Yes.
And just as a historian, how do you approach? How did you approach the languages? Who are the people that you worked with?
To find out about this, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing is, I realized after a while, and maybe some of the historians here have had the same experience. What language are these people speaking? We often go around and we have you're working on. I know you're working on travel accounts and so forth, or we meet peasants working with landlords, and there are different dialects. What are language? How are they talking to each other? So it was that kind of question that interested me, and I really began to think about it very, very seriously. And it seemed to me also, as I've just suggested in answering that interesting question about the long-range consequence, that it wasn't just important for describing what went on and understanding communication, that language really is part of political argumentation and intellectual argumentation. I mean, it certainly is today. Here in Canada, we have, this is very central. But that language was a form of cultural activity that people used to judge other people. The things that I was saying about Schuchardt and his critique of the German school, issues of racism and of national identities were very much tied up in arguments about whether there was a pure language, which language was the best language. Those were deeply big arguments. So it seemed to me not unimportant to follow this line. How did I do it? You wonder. How do you get into it? I was lucky. Not only the linguists are blessed, but I had all these sources for Suriname. I had these, and there are several others. There are, of course, people today who are still speaking it, and Richard Price has written wonderfully. He learned Saramaccan, and he and Sally Price have gone and worked with Saramakans today. But we have sources that start in the 1690s from Suriname, and so you just use them. and already there are collectors from the early 19th century who have folk tales in Sranan and in Saramaccan, which are collectors who are working among the enslaved population. Emancipation doesn't come till 1863 in Suriname. So that's and then you just pay a lot of attention to what people say or don't say about communication. And the main argument I've tried to make, some of the linguists do, I don't know if any of them are here, but there's a journal of Pidgin and Creole languages. This has become a very fashionable subject among linguists. There's a journal of Pidgin and Creole languages, and there's several very important people who are working on it. And they tend to look at something like Sranan or the Creoles in the Caribbean of their own important linguistic categories, and some of the things that we historians can contribute to their work, because we can visualize the situation, are quite important. For instance, I don't know if several of you where Alejandro is, but other people who are working on the Caribbean and others, that when I say that these Creole languages could not be created by owners, even though the words are English, for instance, the English are there for about 15 years, okay? Most of them leave. We have a language which must be passed on by slaves and created primarily by slaves, because the English are not there speaking their English language to get the. It was picked up early along, and then it was elaborated and by slaves because they needed it desperately. They didn't need it just to order each other around. They needed it because they had to get families going and all the things that I mentioned. And I think that that's what we historians can contribute to the work of linguists, that we can visualize what the situation is when languages grow and change. and can see that they cannot be, possibly just simply in the construction of owners or directors who don't know a thing. Well, they don't know a tiny little bit about the lives of these people. And yet these words all surface that describe practices that Europeans know nothing about. So I think that that's a contribution that we can make in this work on language.